I often think of the Vineyard as my blank canvas, a place that I come to try different things or to experiment or to work in different ways, but also because it's this incredibly known quantity for me. It's the place I know the best. It's my home. And if that's true, then I can come here and reapproach the same with a different head, with a different interpretation. So here we are, I'm 74, and I've been photographing here since my 20s. It's the place that I reference or come back to reapproach. And that's remarkable as an artist. There are many artists that have photographed the same tree, or Monet photographing the same gardens over many, many years. Painting them. And to reapproach the same, the familiar, with a different frame of mind as an artist is tremendously rich and fulfilling. And to find new things from it. As a more mature person, to understand more from it, or to realize that as a younger man I didn't work that way because I didn't understand, or I didn't have that depth, or I didn't have that ability to understand the other implications of things that I'm photographing. So a deeper understanding. I don't photograph the same way I did then. I can't. I'm physically not able as well, but I'm not so flashy, I'm not so fast, I'm slower, and I care or revere more kind of what I'm pointing the camera at. One of my teachers was Harry Callahan, very famous wonderful photographer, and had been very influential to me. He just said this thing earlier in my studies with him, or he said it to the class, I guess, is the subject is everything. And if you look at Harry's pictures and you compare what he said, it seems like completely so wrong. How could he possibly say that the subject is everything when, in fact, he really didn't care about the subject at all? It didn't seem like he did, and yet what the picture became was important to him. So he was transforming what he was working with to make it like an artist or a painter, except he was photographing. It took me a while to understand that the subject is everything was this incredibly humble statement, and practically a religious statement from him, basically saying that he was relying upon the world, the subject, for his pictures. And as I grew older and started to grow into my work a little bit more, I realized that at the Vineyard, it's the same thing. I'm totally dependent upon what's here to make my art, to be an artist. And so I'm relying upon the subject. And if you don't revere that, or you don't love that, or you don't care about that, it seems negligent to me, or irresponsible almost. So yes, the subject is everything, and the subject is the most important thing that I work with. Most people, when they go up to make pictures aerially, are doing it for survey work, or to shoot real estate, or to talk about erosion or climate change or something like that, or to photograph a location for a road that's going to be built or something. So there's this purpose, right? And I'm different, I'm just an art guy. So I'm just going up to try to make the best pictures I can. And if something becomes sort of beautiful or meets my standards or something, I'll photograph it. So that's this wonderful privilege or ability that I have, that I revere so much, to be able to do that. To be at this incredibly beautiful place and then allowed to photograph it pretty much as I want. The other thing that's kind of unique is that we all, as islanders, are confronted with that dirt road that we want to go down to see what's at the end of that dirt road that says no trespassing, right? And I don't violate that. Maybe as a kid, or a younger guy, I did. I don't anymore. It's too crazy a world. But from the air, it's carte blanche. I'm above that, looking at that, looking down that road, and seeing what is at the end. And it's maybe just a house, on a beautiful location, but it might be a promontory or a peninsula or something on one of the ponds that's just so exquisitely beautiful, and sometimes looking almost tropical or Caribbean-like, in the midsummer. That's just phenomenal. And there's no way I can get down there on the ground, Just the patterns that are formed. And of course, that would change based upon tide, the light, what time of year you're there, what time of day, all that would change. And I've had that happen too, where I photograph something and it seems great, but it seems like it's lacking something. And then I'll go up again and I'll hit that again and try to see if I can find something different happening from it. And sometimes the second time is best, and sometimes the first is best. The way of photographing aerially is qualitative through quantity. You have to shoot a lot. So in an hour with Mike, I'm shooting 400 or 500 frames. And then, of course, I have this nightmare of editing. How do I choose which is better, what I'm trying to do? Usually I'm trying to get the finished body of work from that shoot, that time that I've been up, down to 15 or 20 prints, final photographs. So that's kind of a game that you have to play. And then you're rejecting things that are probably fine, but aren't quite what you're trying to do or what you're trying to say. So the pictures in the other gallery, those black and whites, I donated to the museum in the fall, and those pictures were shown by the museum when it was in Edgartown in 1985. I'd spent the previous 4 or 5 years making those pictures, those and many others, and that was in reaction to really major levels of development taking place on the island. Lots of buildings, that phenomenon when you come back to the vineyard in the spring, the leaves aren't on the trees yet, you look through the trees and you see a new house. That was going on a lot in the 80s. The first thing I started to do was to figure out if there was something I could do with pictures that I would make here. I approached the Vineyard Open Land Foundation because I'd noticed that their brochure and their visuals were terrible. And so I proposed that I make pictures for them. If they wanted to use them, they could. And in turn, they provide me with access to some of their properties that they were managing. So that allowed me to be on property like the Hornblower land that I wouldn't have been able to get to otherwise. And so I photographed. They used my pictures quite a bit, and by 93 or 94, they were using my pictures in their publicity material. I was working under the model of what Eugene Atget had done in Paris in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in reaction to Paris becoming industrialized. He was an unknown photographer who documented the changes in his city that he lived in and loved. So I used that as a way to kind of form a base or a foundation of what I was doing here. My basic premise was that I was photographing land that wasn't built on yet, that probably inevitably was going to become developed. What we used to call Keith's Farm, which was on Middle Road, down in, across the field, down into the woods, where the woods are there a little bit, in some property that was going to have, at the other end of it, some development a year or two later. So I had a sort of a checkered career as a student, bouncing around from different schools and actually getting disinvited from the University of Denver. No longer welcome because my grades were so bad. I ended up being an art student and then transferred in my junior year, after being at a junior art college, to Rhode Island School of Design. And wanted to be a painter, had been a painter in the junior art school, but was also taking photography courses. And one of the first assignments was to work with a 4x5 view camera in my intro class, given a school camera, and had a 1-week assignment to make pictures with that camera. Didn't know, had been shown how to use it, but didn't know how to use it. And ended up here for the weekend, which I tended to do, because it was a good place to practice, to try out, to not be hassled with downtown Providence or something, but just to be in a place that I knew. And I was photographing Keith's Field and woods or the beach or something. Set up this big bulky camera, black cloth over my head, made a series of maybe 6 or 8 pictures, sheet of film, slide being pulled out, click, make the picture, go back to the darkroom in Rhode Island at school, process the film, and each one of the frames I shot had a kind of something in the way of the picture, way out of focus in the foreground. Didn't know what that was, took that to my teacher and said, "What is that?" He said, "Well, that's the rail of the camera in your frame. So it was a monorail camera that stuck out, and if the front of the camera was back far enough, you'd get the actual, I didn't see it when I was under that dark cloth. So classic mistake, right? Wonderful thing about photography is it teaches you mistakes visually. So I never made that mistake again, but that was the success of my first assignment, was to blow it, right? But that started a precedent that I still use today. The Vineyard is a place that I practice, or I try out a new idea, or experiment, or to stretch things out a little bit, try to extend my way of seeing, because it's known, it's safe, and it's probably my most comfortable place. For me, it's home. So this is a long time ago for me to put myself into that head to say, I think I'm out there with a big camera just trying to see what I can. I'm probably at Vincent's or Squibnocket. I'm experimenting with the water coming in, coming out. In that game, with doing that, with movement, with a big camera like that, you can try to stop the movement with a faster shutter speed or let it blur. Did a lot of work that way with a longer shutter opening and therefore a lot of blur. This one's quite sharp. And I think I'm just trying to show this detail and move us into kind of a study of texture and form and tonality. The next one, Lambert's Cove, somewhere down there, east side. In those days, I spent a lot of time trying to get at things. So in the landscape game, you're often trying to get a little bit above things to get at it. If you're on the ground and you're photographing something right in front of you, it can very often present kind of a barrier to what's back behind there. And you can see in number 15, I'm above somehow. I've worked to get above it, so I'm photographing a pond and then a spit of land and then the east side of the ocean as well. And so that was it, is to try to get that. And then to use the light that I had or the tonalities that I had to make an effective black and white photograph. Another thing that happens in landscape work is we're always in this challenge and dilemma of what do I do with the sky? Is it too light? Is it so light the eye kind of fades off it or slides off it? Is it too dark? Does it support my photograph or does it conflict with my photograph? And this one, through chance or luck, seems to kind of fit. You can play with that a little bit in the darkroom in those days to burn it down or make it a little bit darker, but you kind of need the right light. There used to be, it was a club actually, it was called Squibnocket Associates, and it was a gate that you had a key to. There was a little parking lot, and back behind the barrier that was the beach itself were the dunes. In this case, they're covered in seagrass, and it was blowing in the breeze, and just a remarkable, I could just walk down this little spit of trail and photograph the backside of the dunes rather than the beach side of them. Zach's Cliffs and became Jackie Onassis's land in those times, became incredibly private, of course, and actually patrolled in those years so that people couldn't go down towards her beach. So I had access to that during that time, and that was kind of an honor. Of course, when I was making these pictures, I didn't know that I was really making something of historical significance, but I'm so old now that it's sort of become that, you know. And I like that characteristic. Tom's Neck, number 7, is now become part of a much larger project by me in much more contemporary times, where I photographed Tom's Neck from the air and from the water. The basic idea, it started with Moser Trail, was that as you're driving along that road, looking at that part of that world, you're seeing, you know, maybe in the background, the band of ocean, some sky, and basically some sort of shrubs or something between the road and where the beach is. You can't really see the beach much, but as you drive by, you know there's land there. And yet from the air and looking down on that is displayed this incredible landscape, right? Just remarkable. It got me thinking about how the landscape presents itself as a kind of a barrier to us very often. There might be a stand of trees behind which there might be something remarkable. You wouldn't know that, of course. And that led me to Tom's Neck, which is very much like that. If you're in a kayak going down that spit from Dyke Bridge, you look at a little bit of a beach and kind of a little bit of marsh right there, and you look at a stand of trees or shrubs or bushes that are kind of a barrier to what's behind that layer. And what's behind that is like the Garden of Eden. It's the most exquisite thing I've ever seen. So get above it, point down at it, it's all displayed. So those two projects are basically that idea, where I've taken the plane, we've flown down along that, and I've photographed it all, displayed in its beauty, and then photographed from that barrier, in the case of Moship Trail, from the street, and then in Tom's Neck from the water, from a kayak. It increases what photography does, or our understanding of the utilization of photography as a landscape tool for making art, is that from above, it's a whole different world. And it has this wonderful way of showing and spreading things out, like a map in all its beauty. That stuff off of Moship Trail is gorgeous. It's very scrubby and kind of sandy, and it's all kind of a mess and disorganized and beautiful. Little trails that people have carved up and over the dunes to get down in there, little twisty paths and so on, some water. It's the best. Photography is a game of isolation, of taking things out of context. How you frame things and what goes on the edge, all that becomes kind of crucial to a landscape photographer. One of the things I learned as I started to shoot aerials was that I had a basic decision to make. Would I bring the camera up and show the overall context by showing a little bit of horizon? Many of my aerials, as the show above demonstrates, don't have horizon lines at all. At the entrance to Seven Gates, there's that long winding road that goes in there. And this was at dawn on a very kind of stormy, midsummer, wet, humid, about to rain kind of morning, muggy. And a little bit of the sun peeking through, and not very typical kind of picture for me to make, and yet was striking. In black and white, you sort of have to put your head into the mind frame of seeing in black and white, not really being so interested in color, understanding this green is going to render this tonality and so on. It's a tonality game, and lights and shadows and darks and lights very important. Contrasty light, kind of dramatic, and very often we use shadows and light, particularly in black and white, to convey depth or to convey distance, right? Flat light tends to sort of universalize things and make things more effectively in one plane. In color, it's a very different game, of course, and we have a palette that's now ranging into thousands or millions, and sort of just a relationship of about 10 different zones or tonalities in black and white. In color, in the aerial work, for me it's a kind of light, but it's also a time of day game. And one of my early things that I learned in color in doing aerials was that if I'm photographing at 3 or 4 in the afternoon and the light is fading down, it might be more dramatic, but it becomes very difficult technically. I need a very fast shutter speed because we're moving at 100 miles an hour. And if I'm losing light, it forces me to make decisions about the ASA, how fast things are going, or to be at an aperture that allows me very little depth of field. So I learned early in the game, in the early 2000s, that for me, for color, is a better game if I'm looking at the morning where light is increasing during the early morning instead of decreasing in the afternoon. So I tend to avoid late afternoon or afternoon shoots. So I'm there with Mike at 7:30 or 8 in the morning. We've got increasing light. It's still kind of dramatic, which is nice that it has shadows and has rich colors. And then it's increasing. 8x10 was really 25 years of being my primary way of making pictures. Always in black and white all those years. Not until about 2003 or 2004 did I start shooting color in 8x10. I hadn't really had any experience in color. I'd been a black and white photographer. And by about 2001 or two, a long-standing project of photographing wheat fields in southeastern corner of the state of Washington, an area called the Palouse. I'd been photographing out there almost every year through the 90s, in 8x10, in black and white. Something in me kind of looked at what that was out there and realized that I was really missing a primary aspect of what those fields were about. They were remarkable. And so I started to photograph them in color. And the first year, just like the first time shooting here in 4x5 and blowing it, I shot about 25 sheets of color transparency, color slide film. Effectively blew them all at great expense, and then learned that I needed to do a little bit more homework before I went back out there the next summer. Went out there the next summer with another 25 sheets. 25 sheets of color transparency film was probably $300, something like that. I mean, pretty expensive. And so did better the second year and started to incorporate color into my process out there. At the same time that the world is beginning to migrate to digital. Early days of digital were pretty crude. I did many of those trips with an early version of a Nikon camera that was pretty bad, in digital. But by 2004 or 5, I was making color 8x10 transparencies that were good and showing them. And then starting to think about being above. Anything about aerial photography is always remarkable. There's certainly been situations where I've been in the environment in photographing at the Vineyard where things have been kind of exceptional. There was one morning in May with Mike, maybe several years ago, where the surface temp in May in the morning was quite cool. We got up into the air and it got warmer. Very strange. As though there was a front or air that was sort of sitting up there stagnant that was warm and kind of humid and summery-like, whereas the surface was, I just thought that was exceptional. Clarity's a big thing. Obviously, if you're 800 feet or 1,000 feet up, you don't want dense air or air that's foggy or something. I'm always wanting the things to be as clear as possible, so I try to pick the weather or the mornings that are clear, right? But they're hugely affected by the air that's over the island, and it affects the pictures, of course. Chappaquiddick has been a real discovery, and I started photographing Chappaquiddick when I was working over at Waiski, and so I was out there a lot and photographing on the ground, and then it seemed inevitable that I start photographing from the air. Pretty natural from the Edgartown airport to hang a left, and all of a sudden you're in Chappie. And it's unique, particularly with number 6, the marshes out there are not like anything else on the Vineyard. And I started to discover Chappaquiddick to somebody from Chilmark maybe isn't something that we know intimately. And it always seemed like there was just that one road out to the end and not much else. At some point I discovered the cemetery, just prowling around. I hadn't known about that. But there's remarkable things out by Cape Pogue and the marsh through there and the pond and Puka Pond and all that was just a revelation. And that has these kind of sand spits that sit out there and are usually pretty populated with birds and surrounded by water. And one of the things I liked about this was that one of the things I care about in my pictures is that you look at the overall picture, of course, but then you get into some of the detail and some of the things that happen in the smaller parts of it. And there's sort of remarkable little bit of waves here, modest waves here, and what's the patterns in the water. And also from the air, you very often see the water and then the bottom, if it's shallow. So you sort of see these layers going down. I got into photographing along the South Shore, trying to do something a little different because we tend to think of, I don't know, photographs as you're standing on the beach. You're standing on the beach and shooting out maybe at the waves and then the ocean behind or the horizon. And to flip that a little bit, where I was sliding the plane along just offshore and pointing in, and that's how the double ones, waves pictures came to be, was that we were just starting about at Vincent's, And just flying the length of the island along the whole South Shore and just plunk, 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 photographing frame after frame, not changing the relationship of the plane to the shore at all, but just photographing things as they changed. And the black, what we see is dark, very dark, is the water working its way in from the pond. And of course the white on the bottom is the wave. And then the other kind of large discovery was actually both. The ponds along the South Shore, so amazing with what kind of sort of a mini environment that they have with bird life and so on. That was wonderful. And then Aquina is just very rich along Moship Trail and the cliffs and the dunes along there. The cliffs themselves, I don't know, I think I just tend to go back there because they produced, pictures. And I've always been very interested in inland areas of the vineyard. From straight down one morning in maybe late May or early June, the water was clear enough and the light was right that you could see down through to it's only maybe 4 or 5 feet deep in there, and you could see the shifting sand underneath. That's what that shows. Well, one of the questions I get is, do you use a drone? And I mean, it's an increasingly good question because it's getting better and better, and there's some remarkable pictures that are coming from drones. But it's too restrictive. If I'm using a drone or working with somebody that's a drone pilot, we're going to go up and we're going to be able to fly around a pretty small area. And if we want to go over there, we're going to have to bring the drone down, go over there, and then go up again. In this instance, the way I shoot with the plane, like I said, I can cover the whole island in about an hour. So it's just a ratio of success to this kind of effort part of this difficulty of putting the drone up, flying around, coming back down again. So, but I mean, if I were younger, I'd probably be in a drone right now and trying to learn that process and trying to apply it to this kind of work. In this day and age, people aren't looking at pictures that are very long. They're not studying them. They don't, they flash by something on the screen, and yeah, I mean, in my blog, I'm always telling people to actually see it on at least a monitor where you can it can open up a little bit. I have this sense of somebody's reading my blog and looking at my pictures on their phone on their way to work on the subway, right? So what are you going to get from that? This thing is magnificent and kind of revealing and incredible in its largest sense as a print, but pretty good on a large screen. And a lot of people have really good screens these days, so at least to let it open up to that size. The camera is and was just a remarkable device because it could contain so much. I mean, we're not seeing it in a small, but in the print in the show, you can, if you look at it, you can see everything is in there. I mean, it's just, this is 8 by 10 inches of contact print, basically. So the fidelity, the rendition, the sharpness, the clarity, the tone out, all those things are at the top of the heap, just remarkable. So keeping that in mind, respecting that, I felt like by pointing in number 16, pointing down, not having much sky above, but just pointing at the backs of those dunes, that was going to render all that in exquisite detail. And that was the game, basically, was to allow that to come across.